remain open to the discussion. We will not resolve every aspect of policing that may need improvement. However, what is shared here could be the catalyst for change. Someone in the audience could be the author of the winning strategy that will cause the shift and eliminate the need for these types of debates. I want to take time to thank our panelists for their time and attention to this matter. I want to thank the Planning Committee for their work and diligence in getting us to this point. And finally, I want to thank our Chancellor, Chancellor Molly Agrawal, for communicating the importance of UMKC being at the forefront of these critical conversations. Leadership comes from the top, and we appreciate you taking us on this challenging journey for the betterment of UMKC and the community beyond. Thank you. Gary?
Thank you, Kimiko, and thank you, Chancellor, for the opportunity to have this critical conversation. My name is Gary O'Bannon, and I will be your co-moderator. Hello once again to those who may have been with us for our first critical conversation on systemic racism in the workplace that was held earlier this month. And hello to those who may be joining us for the first time. However you found us, we invite everyone present to join us for each of our planned critical conversations. And we ask, without shame, that next time you bring others along with you as well, because we love a crowd. I'd like to take a moment to introduce my co-moderator, Jasmine Ward. I met this young lady about 10 days ago, and you know, sometimes you just meet someone and you immediately recognize what I call good people. That's Jasmine Ward. I'm going to turn it over to JW so she can introduce herself, but I am pleased to have her join us today. Jasmine.
Thank you, Gary. As Gary was saying, my name is Jasmine Ward. I am in my third year at UMKC School of Law, and there I am the president of the Black Law Students Association. I'm very pleased to have you all here with us tonight. I've been learning a lot in preparation for this panel, and I'm really excited to learn even more going on tonight. Gary?
Thanks, Jasmine. All right, on to our topic. The calls for police reform didn't begin when former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin put his knee on the neck of George Floyd, not letting up for over 8 minutes until Floyd died. However, Chauvin, who was charged with his murder, and Floyd were just the latest chapter of a bigger story. Before moving forward, let's go back in history. After the founding of the country, police enforced explicitly racist laws on slavery and segregation. In more recent decades, law enforcement has been at the forefront of enforcing policies in the war on crime and drugs, which has culminated in massive racial disparities in police stops, use of force, arrest, incarceration, the death penalty, and just about every other aspect of the criminal justice system. Most won't dispute this as fact. These disparities have served to erode the community trust that is critical to effective policing. It also results in surveys that show Black and brown people trust police at half the rate of their white counterparts. These disparities have kept Black and brown communities less safe, suffering disproportionately not just from police violence, but also crimes that go under-policed. It has led to thousands, if not millions of Americans to protest in the streets against police violence and systemic racism, and a national call for police reform. Like many other cities, that call has also taken place here in Kansas City. And the call begs the question, what should reform look like? Potential solutions are complex, emotional, and in many respects, is also deeply personal to many. For that reason, as part of UMKC's Critical Conversation series, we want to begin a dialogue on this topic. Note that I said begin. We're building this as part one of a discussion on the future of police reform with the focus on Kansas City, Missouri. We anticipate part two occurring later this month, and we hope you will join us for that conversation as well. We can't promise you we'll have all the answers, but what I can promise you is a panel as distinguished as the one we brought to you this afternoon. And to that point, I have the pleasure of asking them to not only introduce themselves, but also to remind each of us of their roles as to what I call community champions for Kansas City. We'll start with Dr. Emmanuel Cleaver III, then Jean Peters Baker, then Damon Daniel, and then our own Dr. Toya Like. Dr. Cleaver?
Hello, as was stated, my name is Emmanuel Cleaver III, and I serve as the senior pastor of St. James United Methodist Church. And I have been involved, along with several members of the clergy, pushing for police reform, independent control of the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department, as well as an independent review board separate from the police to review matters of police harassment and just misconduct by the police altogether. So this is something I've been involved in heavily over the last few months.
Ms. Peters-Baker?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jean, prosecutor in Jackson County, and I've had the privilege of serving in that role now for the past 8 years. And prior to that, about 15 years prior to that, I've served as an assistant prosecutor in the same county. I've left the office a couple of times, once to go serve in the Missouri legislature. That was really a wonderful experience. One would not evidence that statement based off the fact that I left that job in 5 months. It was a really wonderful, wonderful job. And I'm really grateful for people who are willing to sign up to go do that work, because it is hard, very hard to leave your family and go to Jefferson City and spend your week potentially with people that you don't really see eye to eye with all the time. But it's a really important job. So my job as prosecutor is to look at issues like this and to see what more my office should and can do, and to make plans to put those words into action. And so that's what we've been working on for a number of years, and we are still on that path, forward path in this regard.
Thank you very much. Mr. Daniel?
Well, good evening, and good evening to my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be joining you this evening. My name is Damon Daniel, as stated. I'm the president of the Ad Hoc Group Against Crime. For those who are unfamiliar with the agency, Ad Hoc Group Against Crime is a nonprofit organization that serves the Kansas City metropolitan area. Our mission is to be a community resource for violence intervention and prevention for individuals, families, and communities impacted by crime and violence. So for some, we are the emergency room for social services, and for others, we are the trusted bridge between the community and the criminal justice system.
Thank you, sir. And we'll close with Dr. Like. Welcome.
Thank you. Again, my name is Toya Like, and I am a faculty member in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at UMKC. This is my 13th year now at the university. And my research really centers race and the influence that it has on crime and justice outcomes. And I also teach in that regard. And so I'm really happy to be here with the panelists and looking forward to a great discussion on this topic.
I'd like to note that our original panel also included former police chief Jim Corwin, but unfortunately, we received word late yesterday that Jim would not be able to join us due to a family emergency. And the entire UMKC community and this panel ask that you keep Jim and his family in your thoughts. As some of you may know, Jim also chairs a public safety committee that's appointed by Mayor Quentin Lucas to review the issues around policing policies. So he will be missed from this panel today, but it's our hope to have Jim with us for part 2. And if I know Jim, he's going to do everything he can to be sure that he can be with us. In addition, in part 2, we hope to have a representative from the KCMO Police Department as well. So our plan today is to have a deep dive discussion for about 75 to 90 minutes, and then give you, the audience, an opportunity to submit questions for consideration to the panel. You can also do that by using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. So let's begin. It's difficult to put a discussion as complex as this in its proper perspective without first taking a look at how we got here. And I'm speaking about the governance structure of our KCMO police system. Most know by now that the city does not govern its own police department at the local level. And we want to start there, which may very well frame our discussion here today. Jasmine is going to start us off by giving us a historical perspective on the concept of local control. Jasmine?
Right. So for anyone who is unfamiliar, local control refers to who appoints a police department's board of commissioners, and that board oversees the department. So in Kansas City, the board weighs in on complaints when KCPD does not agree with recommendations from the Office of Community Complaints, and that the board the power to fire the chief of police. So if the city's mayor and city council whom the city votes for, the governor, it's 9, when Tom Pendergast gained local control. And if you aren't familiar with him, he was a political boss. So he wanted local control so he could, bribe the police, make them look the other way, get what he wanted. The governor in 1939 took that control away, and it's been in the governor's hands ever since then. So today, the department is overseen by a 5-member board of commissioners, made up of the mayor and 4 people who are appointed by the Missouri governor. And there's your history lesson.
All right, thank you, Jasmine. I have the pleasure of moderating our first group of questions to the panel, so let's get going. Let's start with Dr. Cleaver. What are the positives and the negatives of local control, and why is it critical to reform efforts?
The positive for local control is simply that we are governing ourselves. I know that right now the governor appoints people who are in Kansas City, but the governor doesn't really know Kansas City. And so it makes more sense that those appointments are made by people from within the city. So a positive is that it's sort of a thing like by the people, for the people, if it's right here and it's local. I think also if it's local, a positive is that it's easier to make reforms within the police department because we don't have to go through Jefferson City. I guess a negative would simply be that we'd have to create something. And there are always challenges when you're creating something new. How exactly are the appointments made? Where within the city do the people who are appointed, where do they come from? And so just the challenges of putting together a new structure, I guess, is not necessarily a negative. I'd say it's more of a challenge. But I do believe that with local control, we can do more. And one thing that I have constantly been declaring that is extremely important, and that is an independent review board. Right now, when complaints are made about the police department, it does go to a review board, but that review board falls under the Kansas City Police Department. So you're basically turning the complaints back over to the people you're complaining about. I don't believe that that will ever change unless we start with local control.
Very good. Jean, did you want to weigh in on this topic as well?
Yeah, I do. I think, as Dr. Cleaver said, there is certainly a challenge that lies ahead, if local control were to come to Kansas City. But I think it's important to point out that every other city in America, every small town in America has found a way to do this. So we are the lone city in America that does not have, what we deem local control of our police department. What that can look like, I suppose, can be a variety of different things. But it's certainly not an insurmountable task to figure it out, since every other jurisdiction in America has figured it out.
And Damon, any comments? Ad hoc group against crime.
I think both Jean and Reverend Cleaver have kind of covered the spectrum a bit. I would just add, I think that maybe on the other side of it a little bit, in terms of this being a public debate about whether or not, or whether this, the pros or cons associated with it. I think when it comes to folks having their voices heard, it's important to understand that there are avenues for that. The big question that having local control really poses is how well are those voices really heard, though? And so people may be present to listen, but are they really being heard? And I think we are seeing some examples of that with the existing calls for the chief's resignation and things of that nature. The commissioners that are there aren't necessarily hearing all of the voices, but that's a longer discussion, a longer debate as well. But I think that it's important for the community to understand that when there's a complaint or something to that respect, there's 3 community organizations that are approved to accept those complaints on behalf of the Office of Community Complaints. It's Westside Housing, Northland Neighborhoods, and Ad Hoc. And so we do receive those complaints, but we turn those over to the Office of Community Complaints. And Reverend Cleaver already explained sort of what happens sort of after that. But there's also other ways in which people's voices can be heard, and that's, of course, going to the Police Board of Commissioners meetings and having those discussions there as well. But again, if you have local control, you don't necessarily have to take off from work. You can call your city council person, or you can kind of go that route as well when you have local control. So there's so many aspects to it that I think that the Kansas City is poised for this conversation, and we need to really continue to have it so that we can make an informed decision. There's several examples of local control throughout the country, and we need to look at those models and look at which one we need to adopt here.
When Mayor Lucas held a press conference to announce a city ordinance that suggested ballot language on local control, asking the public if it wanted local control, the clergy was present, as were supporters of the effort. The police department was not. Now, I understand it's a political environment, it's a political question, but do we know whether or not the police department or the Board of Police Commissioners supports local control? And I'll start again with Dr. Cleaver.
Now, that's a great question. I think privately, there are perhaps some officers who are for. I've talked to a few, but as a whole, there's not been a statement. In terms of the board, the police commissioners, I've heard from at least one who said that the reason why it was taken out of the hands of Kansas City was to prevent corruption. So that's why it's in Jeff City. Now, I find that argument a little hard to swallow because Jefferson City is a political town in and of itself. So there's always the possibility of corruption. But as a whole, I don't know that the board is for local control. There has not been a lot that I've heard from them about this is the route that we should go. I know the mayor has talked about putting something on the ballot so that the citizens can decide. But of course, after the citizens decide, it still has to go to Jefferson City because we don't have local control.
You know, St. Louis was the other last standing city to not have local control, and they found themselves a billionaire who actually sponsored that campaign. Is that necessary in order to get local control passed through the legislative procedure or through the voting mechanism?
I wouldn't think so. I mean, I think if the citizens of Kansas City said this is what we want, then I think Jefferson City has to listen. I think if people stand up and the governor and others see that this is the route to go, then I think that would be a statement in and of itself. And I know one of the arguments against local control is people saying, look at what's happening in St. Louis. And my response has always been, we're not St. Louis. And you're pointing out one city, but look at all the other cities. So we're different from St. Louis in a lot of ways. One, we have much better barbecue. So I'm sure we could figure out a way.
Anything to add, Jean? And then Damon. Anything to add, Jean, to that?
I will add to that. Thanks, Gary. I think that I was in the legislature in 2011 when this measure for St. Louis went through the legislative process. And we all knew the spin behind that vote, that the billionaire was somehow behind it and supporting it, but it didn't matter to any of us. Certainly as a Kansas City representative, I didn't care what a billionaire thought of the St. Louis Police Department. I wanted to know what my other colleagues from St. Louis thought about it and what they wanted. And I was going to give that vote exactly as they wanted it to be, because it is their city, it is their police department, and they were elected to represent a group of constituents. So it seemed very clear I should listen to them. There was really no problem pushing that through. And when I served in the House, it was Representative Jamila Nasheed who largely carried it. And she moved over to the Senate. So she's been a long-standing public servant. But I don't think the fact that, any particular individual is behind it is important. But I will point out, as I learned from the Kansas City Star recently, that the Kansas City Board of Police Commissioners is only 5-member board, but has 6 paid lobbyists. On top of that, the Kansas City's Fraternal Order of Police had 10 lobbyists. So there's some politics for sure at play when you have 16 lobbyists, coming out of one department. So, politics will definitely be at play.
How about you, Damon? Anything to add from your perspective?
Well, I've heard sort of a mixed bag from both commissioners. I've heard from a couple of commissioners that are against it, but I've heard from a few officers as well, some for it and some against it. The argument for some that I've heard that have been against local control have essentially said that the Fraternal Order of Police would get more powerful under a local control versus where it's at now, because they'll have more political clout in terms of being able to contribute to local council folks, campaigns and things of that nature, and may be able to sway folks that way. And so some folks feel as though it's safer, that it's not in the hands of city council because of the FOP. So those are just some, that was one argument that I heard that I thought, I hadn't thought about that part of it at this point, but that was one issue that was raised.
Well, and that is an interesting perspective. I'm going to put you on the spot, and not picking on you, Dr. Cleaver, but I'm going to have you go first. So before we look forward, if you had to give a school grade to our police department and its impact on our community, good or bad, how would you rate it? A, B, C, D, E, F being your options?
Well, I'd probably somewhere between a C- and a D+. I think in terms of, and this has been disputed, in terms of crimes being solved.
Okay.
I've heard a bunch of different numbers thrown out. Some say it's extremely good, higher than the average in the country, but as Jean is shaking her head, I've heard just the opposite. But I think in some of the handling of the peaceful protesters down at the plaza, I think the police department had to be marked down for how they handled those protesters. But I think also you have some complaints that have gone unanswered against the police department. So I would say somewhere around a C- to a D+, and others I'm sure would give them much lower than that, and maybe some even higher.
Well, we'll find out from this panel. Jean, how about you?
I don't think I'm probably the right person to assess a grade for my police department, but I can give some facts. I can give some baseline facts of which all of us should work from. And facts are just that, they're facts. So you can't change them because you don't like them. But the truth is, I hired a criminologist to work in my office last year. It's one of the best investments I've had that I've engaged in for that office because we started really digging into data. And what we learned is that only 2 out of 10 violent crimes even come to the prosecuting attorney's office for review. Of course, I'm not a rubber stamp to the police. I'm my own separate entity. And so I will evaluate evidence based on my legal training as to whether or not that case should be filed or not. So that doesn't mean 2 in 10 violent crimes get filed. It just means 2 in 10 get sent to my office. That means 8 are not solved. 8, that is an outstanding number. So, we have to own that. And that's just not, I'm not just laying that at the police department's feet. All of us need to own that number. That's just unacceptable. And you cannot look at community and wag a finger at them and tell them they have to do better and nobody else in a government structure has to do better. That's, that's a recipe for a really bad relationship, when there's a lot of finger pointing one direction and none back at yourself. So as someone that holds a county function and a significant role in the criminal justice system, there's a lot of things that we can do to change that bottom line. And the best way to solve crime is to have a good, solid relationship with community. Because if community trusts you, if they believe you're legitimate, they will talk to you. They will help you. They will do what's not even in their best interest. They will tell on their neighbor. They will testify. And that's the very, very best way, is to build legitimacy between the police department and all criminal justice partners and the community. And then we can change that number, that 2 in 10 number. But I want to give one more statistic.
Is this just on my end, or should we go to Damon?
Go ahead.
Hey, I think Jean was on the roll. I want to hear that one more statistics that she had, because I really think that when you talk about grading the police department, just stating the facts, as Jean said, you can't, they're just facts. And so you can't argue the facts. And if we take what she's saying to heart, then I think we all walk away with our own sort of judgments around it, around those facts. So yeah, I would love to hear your last fact.
The last fact is all crime. When you consider all crime, 1 in 10 cases make it to the Jackson County Prosecutor's Office for review. 1 in 10. So that would include burglaries and car thefts and everything. So 1 in 10. Fact. That's a fact.
Yeah.
We're talking a lot right now about, the facts of our police department and their interaction with our community. And in the community right now, there's been a lot of calls and conversation about defunding police departments. And we're obviously talking about reforming police departments. So my question for anyone who wants to jump in, but I'm going to send it to you first, Dr. Cleaver, is what do those 2 terms mean to you, defunding versus reforming, and kind of which fit the city better?
Well, I would say I prefer the term reform, because defunding is just, that language is divisive because people take it a number of different ways. So how I understand defunding the police is, we're going to look at how much money the police department is receiving, and we're going to see where we can use it in other areas. Reform, I understand, we're taking, the police department, they have their budget, and we're looking at how it should be spent. As again, I said, I think the word defunding turns a lot of people off, because they hear it and say, well, you're saying we don't want any police at all. And that's a dangerous thing. And it's even being used in political ads right now. So I try to steer away from that language. I do think that money given to the police department can be reallocated, even within the department, not even taking it outside of the police department. What I think really would go a long way, and it goes back to something that Gene said earlier, are community programs with the police. We cannot ignore the fact that there is a long history of tension between minority communities and the police. And as long as you have that, we're not going to get anything done. So I think we need to reallocate funds, even within the police department, because we need to build trust, not rebuild trust, because there was never any trust to begin with, but build trust between the police department and minority communities. That's how we're going to really make a difference. So I use the word reallocate as opposed to defunding. And yes, I think there has to be some reform within the police department. The police department, much of what we know was birthed out of slave patrols. And slave patrols were set up, white men to keep slaves in check, to stop rebellions, and to hunt down runaway slaves. Our modern day policing is birthed out of that. And so just the history in and of itself says there has to be some sort of reform. I'll also say, because I know other panelists probably have something to say about this, but I think there also has to be an effort in recruiting minority police officers, because right now the police department, Kansas City, Missouri Police Department, does not look like the community it is policing. So if we could reallocate money for recruitment, and it's going to be hard to recruit officers of color unless we first build relationship within the community.
All right, I did my disappearing act, but now I'm back. Damon, what are your comments?
Yeah, I look at the two differently. So, I mean, when I hear the word reform in reference to the police department, I think about, the calls for more transparency, banning the chokehold and things like that. So it's more around policy. When I hear defunding, it's more around the budget. And like Reverend Cleaver, I don't really like to hear the word defund myself. I tend to think about reallocation of dollars. I saw some statistics that came across my email earlier this week. Actually, I think it was last week, where I was told that, so when we think about what the city of Kansas City is mandated to spend out of its general fund towards the police department, is 20%. By law, they're mandated to spend 20% of their budget towards the police department, but they're spending 38%. I also saw in the same document of statistics that since 2012, crime has increased by 42%, and the city's contribution has also increased by 28%. Now, when we take into account inflation and things of that nature, those things have to be taken into account. But when you consider the facts that Gene put forward in terms of the effectiveness of the current policing, particularly around violent crime and homicides, we have to begin to ask ourselves, are we spending the money wisely? I'm not a proponent of defunding the police at all, but I think that we definitely need to look at how we are allocating dollars towards violence prevention in this city. And that's something we really need to take a stronger look at. And I think that the opportunity for citizens, particularly registered voters in Kansas City, will have an opportunity to voice that in the upcoming budget hearings that the city is going to be doing. And so safety and violence has always been an issue that people talk about, but sometimes that doesn't mean that they want all of those dollars going to the police department. And so I think that with the current debate and the current conversations that are happening, that we may begin to see a shift. But those are conversations that I really want to encourage residents and elected officials and voters to begin to have those dialogues about where are our priorities when it comes to funding violence prevention activities in the city.
Gene Peters.
I'm going to join the chorus. I do not wish to have a defunded police department. I want to know that if I need to call 911 or a community member around me needs to call 911, that a trained professional is going to show up from the police department and assist them and help them and protect them and lead them through the next steps that are needed. So that's critical. There's a lot of room, however, within a department budget as the size of KCPD's, perhaps to look at the idea of reimagining certain police jobs, looking at how we have historically policed, and can we do that differently? Should we do it differently? Would it even be good for police that they have been perhaps asked to do things that they're not the most qualified to do, perhaps, in the area of drug enforcement, which I think the literature would certainly show that was a failed effort. The war on drugs was a very expensive, damaging, failed effort. So maybe we got to move out of that traditional mode and really focus resources out of the police department, but toward people that know how to manage addiction and treatment rather than drug enforcement. And that's just an idea, and it's one that I think could have some merit. And I'd like to hear from Dr. Like on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Like, your background certainly places you as an expert in this area. What are your thoughts?
So I think we've got to, again, just tackle this issue of misconceptions about what defunding is. Defunding doesn't mean we don't have police services, or in fact, the argument could be made that defunding could lead to more adequate police services, in that it would be, as Dr. Cleaver was saying earlier, it's really reallocation of funding to other units that may be better able to address some of the issues that communities are dealing with as it relates to crime issues that are probably better handled by social services, mental health professionals, even reallocation into housing, education, and these sorts of things that will have an impact on public safety from a criminology or study of crime standpoint. We know if we address some of those issues, we will then have some impact on crime rates. And so, of course, the sort of propaganda around defunding the police now and sort of the stigma that's attached to that phrasing or that word certainly invokes this idea that means less policing, but it may mean more effective policing in the long run. I'm more critical of reform, because reform typically means using funding that's already allocated to the police and distributing it toward things that we've advocated for in the past, like body cameras and things like this that we know have not been effective. They have not resulted in, less violent encounters between the community and the police, or de-escalation of those encounters. So I think, probably more so than anything else, we certainly have to sort of ground our understanding of defund, reform, or even abolish of policing as we know it. And again, I think that has a lot to do with the point that was made earlier about, if we look at the history of policing in the United States, where everything in our criminal justice system as a whole was modeled after the English system of crime and justice. The advent of slavery and what will become the United States meant a different form of criminal justice practices that are particular to people of color, and namely African Americans. So, while again, our policing is modeled after the English system of policing, slave patrols is a unique style and form of policing that is particular to the United States, no different than plantation justice, and even our correction system, and what Michelle Alexander in her work calls the new Jim Crow, right? And so the way in which race has reared its ugly head in terms of practices and criminal justice practices really forces us to think about not just this in terms of policing, but this in terms of our criminal justice system overall, given police are sort of the gateway into the criminal justice system overall. And so thinking about the number of violent crimes that are unreported and unresolved, in addition to property crimes, I mean, it shows you that disconnect, that huge disconnect between the communities that are served by the police and need those services, but their unwillingness to connect with them or to use them as a resource for resolving disputes or handling those matters. And so I think we're talking about bigger systemic issues here that if we had more grounded conversations around reforming the police and what that actually entails, defunding it and what that really looks like, even if we need to use different language there, and abolishment of policing services as we know it, where now community safety is in the hands of the community. I think those are some really critical conversations around this issue overall that are going to be had and need to be had.
Dr. Like, I'm going to keep this next question with you. Is it asking too much for a public apology, particularly when communities of color believe that there's still denial that is still in the system?
I don't think it is at all, but I think it has to happen. So I think when I think of criminal justice professions, period, and where police fall on that hierarchy, if you will, they're task executors. So they're at the bottom of that hierarchy. They're not task definers. So now we've got to look critically at legislation around where the police are mobilized and what they do, and who's making those decisions and so then who does that apology come from, you know? And so I think, again, this goes way further up the chain in terms of that apology. I mean, even thinking about our nation publicly acknowledging what slavery has done in terms of systemic racism in our society and how it continues to permeate in our society. And so where does that apology come from? I think that has to be, again, that has to be on a broader level than starting with the police.
Sure. Jean, you often hear police departments when they see things like the George Floyd murder, pointing to a few bad apples. But if you have 100 officers on the force and 10 are bad, and the other 90 know of those 10 wrongdoings, do you in fact have 100 bad officers as opposed to just 10?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Because every organization has bad apples, every single one. Maybe not, Reverend Cleaver's church, right? But everywhere else, that just exist because we're human beings. And the question then becomes, what kind of system do you have to protect people who come forward to report bad conduct of someone else? Are they supported? Are they protected? And if officers know that if I speak up here, I may find myself riding alone on a patrol, and when I call for backup, they aren't going to come. Think about that. When things like that occur within a police department, that's a sick department. That's sick. And we just have to acknowledge that it would be sick in any, in a ward where, a group of nurses work. It doesn't matter the environment. So I'm not just trying to pick on a police department here. Every single department in America, right? Any workplace must have strong whistleblower protections. But beyond that, you have to have a leader that will speak for what's right, that will back people who have stepped forward at peril to themselves and protect them, make sure they are protected and that they know they're going to be protected. So without that, I don't even think a whistleblower law or a provision is going to help.
Dr. Cleaver.
Yeah, I think the whole bad apple statement is an easy way out. I think we have to look at the structure itself, the system. I heard one of the Kansas City police officers say that, let's say you have 10% of KCPD that are just bad apples. Then you have another 10% that they do everything by the book. They're honest, the whole nine. And then you have the 80 who are like, we really don't care. And that corrupts the whole department. If you have 80% that are not going to say anything when you see the 10% doing all the things that they're doing. There is a culture within policing, and that is you don't tell on other officers, you protect officers. And as long as that culture is alive and well, then it doesn't matter that there are only one or two bad apples, because the rest aren't really going to do anything about it.
Damon? Do you have 100 bad, or do you have 10 bad?
You know, if I walked into a store with a friend, my friend pulled out a gun and robbed the store, I would be an accessory to that robbery and arrested immediately, and then having to prove my innocence. I think that we have failed ourselves by not holding law enforcement to a higher standard. If we bar attorneys who may do something unethical and they're no longer allowed to practice law, or if a doctor commits a malpractice and falls guilty to a malpractice lawsuit and accidentally kills someone, they lose their license. They're no longer able to practice medicine again. Why is it that we don't hold law enforcement officers to the same standard? We need to hold them to the same higher standards as we do doctors and lawyers and things of that nature. I mean, these folks are, they carry guns, they enforce the law, but at the same time, we don't hold them to higher standards, and we really should. That's my 2 cents on that.
Mm-hmm. You know, appearances can be deceiving, but in many of these situations that you see on TV and you see these images that have led to the deaths of unarmed Blacks, it certainly seems as though there was an opportunity where police could have avoided those situations that actually led them to use force. And perhaps this is where bias is driving this factor of excessive force, and it comes along before an officer even pulls out his or her gun. It can happen when an officer decides to approach a scene in a certain way. But when excessive force does occur, or they engage in other types of misconduct, I think we all agree that there needs to be more transparency and accountability in the aftermath. Have you heard anything in Kansas City's plan for the future where reform would address more transparency? And I'll start with Jean.
Oh,
No?
I haven't heard of anything. I have not heard of anything. And I really would like to hear of something here. I'd like to put an idea out that would gain more, power in the hands of community members on this very issue. I visited the city of Milwaukee a few years ago to look at what a professor led review of homicides kind of produces for them. And it was a sentinel review where the professor sort of led this discussion with community members and different agency partners to analyze what went wrong for that homicide to have occurred. Mm-hmm. Imagine if we could do that in regard to, a law enforcement shooting. I think that would have a lot of value. Certainly, I don't think somebody like me ought to lead that, but I think someone like Dr. Like should lead that kind of review and discussion. And it really does then put it in the hands of community to peel back several layers of the onion to see what happened, what went wrong. If it doesn't meet proof beyond a reasonable doubt for a criminal charge, what else, what other failures are in there? Because there may be a whole lot of other failures, or I don't know, maybe not. But policy we could look at, and training aspects, and perhaps even biases, right? If an unarmed Black man is shot and killed because in a very quick discussion, it would be good for community to dig into that kind of discussion to find out, did bias play a role in that? How possibly did it play a role? And then more importantly, from these Sentinels reviews, what can we do about it? How can we change that going forward? So I know a lot of pressure gets put on my office to file criminal charges in these cases, and there should be. But that is the highest standard that we have in the entire system of review. I think, if it doesn't start at, it doesn't meet proof beyond a reasonable doubt, it's kind of a nothing here. And to me, that's just a real missed opportunity to find other problems that we could correct.
Dr. Like, Jean has offered you up. Do you accept, and what are your thoughts?
I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, to assume that the police are not affected by implicit biases that we all suffer from, with race being a primary one. I mean, studies have shown time and time again that we all suffer from implicit biases, and this preference toward white in our society is ubiquitous, even among people of color. And so research within criminology that has shown time and time again that unarmed African Americans, more so than whites, are more likely to be shot by the police. I mean, it's very telling. And so, but to the point that was made also, that even though we can recognize that implicit bias and how it rears its ugly head in police civilian encounters, especially encounters with civilians of color, we certainly give the police an authority we do not give any other agent of social justice in the United States. They have the authority to use lethal force in enforcing the law. And so knowing how that guides their decisions, how that guides what they do, and the fears that they bring to the table, and how that affects their encounters with the public is really important. And so being able to systematically look at those encounters, especially given that authority that's given to the police, when they invoke that authority and use lethal force in an encounter or use force, then being able to assess after the fact what was done in that encounter and to help improve how those encounters might happen is certainly important, and a step toward us trying to resolve these issues.
Thank you. Dr. Cleaver and then Damon.
I would say on top of that, I think the cultural awareness training is critical, especially when you have officers born and raised in rural Missouri coming to Kansas City and or St. Louis, because these are the big police departments in Missouri, and have never had an encounter, a real life conversation with a person of color, then you're going to have some challenges. But I also say what needs to be talked about even more is more psychological evaluations. Right now, all you have to do is go through one, but a lot happens over the course of a year or 2 years, 3 years. But right now, there's no mandatory evaluation psychologically unless an officer is a part of a shooting. So I think that has to become a part of the culture of policing, that they are put in dangerous positions, and it's a stressful job. And I understand that, and I appreciate that. Thank you for your service. But at the same time, because it is so stressful, there has to be, from time to time, officers being evaluated to say, is this officer psychologically able to go out into the field and police effectively? I think if we did that, we find more and more officers who do need a break from time to time. And I think that would make a huge impact.
Good points. Damon?
I'm still stunned by Jean's answer to your question. And that's that there has been no movement towards resolving these issues. As much protests and unrest that we've had in this city, and all of what's happening across this country, there's been no movement in this direction, no debates, no real conversations happening that's going to take us forward. I think that's a real problem. That's a serious problem that we have. And we're hearing that from the top prosecutor, the top law enforcement official in our county, that says that there's been no movement to make that kind of change. And these are serious things that we're talking about here. So the question I have is, what does that say about the leadership that we have in place if there's been no movement towards it? That's a serious problem.
Jasmine, I'm going to hand off to you for the next set of questions, and we will be taking audience questions in the next probably about 20 minutes. So Jasmine, I'll turn it over to you. Take it away.
Thank you. So just now we were talking a lot about kind of the culture of the police department and how it relates to the community, like the relationship between that culture and the community. And it also looks like the culture of the police department and its relationships, its internal relationships, needs to be assessed. So the first question I have for you all, and I'm going to start with Jean, is people are kind of rightfully wary of the prosecutor and the police officer's relationship. Another local reform related just to this issue involves the KCMO Police Board's approval to send major use of force complaints and their officer-involved shooting incidents to outside agencies for independent review. Has there been a firm process established on how this is going to happen and when it's going to happen?
There is. Let me back up to the first part of your statement about the relationship between prosecutor and police, and then how that relates to community. One thing that pains me really greatly, and it weighs on me greatly, is I believe the person I represent is a homicide victim's mom who is waiting for an answer for what happened to her son. And so many of them are waiting for answers. And I owe her the very best service I can give her, the very, very best I can offer her. I never want to be stuck in a scenario where she believes, oh, there's some dysfunction, at the top leadership level, and therefore that has an impact on my son's murder case. So while I think it's painful to have public debates, and I certainly don't like it. I don't like having a public debate. Sometimes you just have to. Sometimes things are so important and they're so far beyond what you can manage in your leadership role that you have to, bring the public into a conversation. That's what I did regarding, police investigating themselves. And it was a painful decision for me, one that I did not take lightly, and one, that I have promised this police chief I will continue to work and be at his side and he be at mine as long as we are both in these roles. We're going to keep working together. We will not always agree on issues, but that is my promise because it is a promise that I made to myself for homicide victims' moms who deserve an answer. Now, that being said, and that preface set up, here we are in a pretty public debate. And this was not just me. My piece of the public debate is pretty small. Even in Odessa, Missouri, there were protests regarding police brutality. There were protests in every corner of America, everywhere. And so we've got to listen to that. And we've got to, not that protesters necessarily, are going to determine the future of a police department, but their voice is important because they are community. And so community must be listened to. And it's where I get my advice and counsel is from community. It is not okay that police investigate themselves and then try and determine the outcome of an investigation that belongs to the prosecutor. That's just not going to be okay. And I want to plainly state that again. It's not okay. That's stepping over a line that should not be crossed over. And that's why I've engaged in this kind of public debate that I'm most uncomfortable with, but I believe necessary to have. I don't know if you had a question in there that I missed.
No, you did wonderfully. Thank you. Does anyone else have comment on that? If not, we can go forward. Dr. Lake? I'm sorry, I saw you shaking your head. To that, so, this culture of like police policing themselves, and we talked a little bit earlier about how maybe that's difficult to do because there's not transparency within the police departments. We hear about the culture of like the blue wall a lot, which is not speaking about issues that are happening within departments. Last month, the police board committed to providing clear guidance for any officer who needed to make a complaint about another officer to the Office of Community Complaints, which those complaints would then be sent to the police board. I don't really want to minimize that action, but is that more symbolic than impactful in really changing the blue wall culture? I can go to Dr. Like and then anyone who has comments after that.
I think Jean hit it on the head earlier when she said, I mean, I remember literally doing a lecture, if you will, in training with some local police officers and talking about the role of race in policing. And sort of the thing that I admonished at the end was that police officers have to be more vocal about officers that don't really represent them in the way in which they respond to people of color. And I remember an officer coming up to me after that and pulling me to the side and saying, what you're saying is valid, but here's the reality that if I were to do that, to step up and really sort of vocalize my complaints with officers who act aggressively, unnecessarily, then they're not going to protect me, on the street. And so, that was something that Jean raised earlier. And I think that's really important is that then how do we protect those officers in the broader scheme of things, right? In terms of doing their jobs when they hold other officers accountable. But also, I think one of the things we haven't touched on that's related to this issue is the role of police unions and how they can be effective. And even when police departments do decide this officer, you're right. So many of these officers who have come to the national attention because of these high profile cases have had issues with prior police departments or within the departments they were a part of, only to have unions, even once those officers were dismissed, have unions help get those officers' jobs back. And so again, I think these things, we can talk about that culture within police departments, but then how these external entities affect police officers is really important too, and the role of police unions being an example.
Thank you. And like you talked a little bit about obviously the police unions and the whistleblowing, and people have a hard time complaining about other people. Guidance that was just passed down, like I was talking about earlier, to let people, tell on one another. It also made clear that any officer who filed a complaint would be given whistleblower protection. But what does that look like, and what does that actually protect from, and does that help the officers protect against other officers, if that makes sense? You can answer that, and then I'd like to hear from Jean about that.
I'm just not convinced. We don't know how that's going to play out until those things are enacted, and if that actually helps to insulate those officers from feeling like other officers won't have their back, or they're not trusted or able to really do their jobs effectively if they act as whistleblowers within their ranks. And so I think that becomes again, when we think about that sort of culture of policing and the discretion that police officers have, I think, it would be interesting to see how effective that really can be. And again, I think it's gonna come down to changing the sort of the cultural orientation of policing overall. It's not us versus them, right? They are supposed to be connected to the communities that they serve, and in serving the community, that there's a standard that they need to sort of adhere to, and be uniform in that, not uniform in sort of closing ranks. And so even if an officer complains about another officer, so Jasmine, I'm still really skeptical about what could really happen there and how effective that could be in terms of insulating those officers that do act as and serve as whistleblowers.
And Jean, can you speak at all to what the whistleblower protections would entail for the KCPD?
Well, it is just what it says, but a whistleblower protection's got to be carried out, and it's got to be demonstrated by leadership that you are going to protect that whistleblower. And I think, I could respond to this by, talking about the past administration. I've worked with this police department for a number of years, and even the last two chiefs, one was just the interim, but he was there for a little bit, several months before Darryl Forte, after Darryl Forte left office. But during those two chiefs, Zimmerman and Forte, they brought cases to me. It was not uncommon for them to call me and for them to say, hey, we've got something that looks problematic. We want you to come look at it. And I filed charges that way of officers they identified and called me about. And then I've also have a charge right now pending against a sheriff deputy for a shooting. And it's a really very serious charge. Nobody, the police union didn't come after me when I filed that charge because it maybe occurred out of the sheriff's department. And, so potentially culturally, there's a different experience about who is it okay to hold accountable and who not. I just think I didn't get death threats. I didn't get, for any of those other cases that I filed. And I think that's telling. I just think that alone is telling that I'm talking about a whole variety of cases. But, one of those is pending right now, going through the criminal justice system, and, the system will handle it, right? I'll either be able to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, or I won't. I believe in this criminal justice system to be that, that accountability day is coming for all of us. We have to either prove our case or we fall a little short. But the response has just been very, very different over a period of years. And when leadership brings you a case, the response is quite different from the department. That's all I will just say. It's noticeable to me. And now that Sheriff Forte is in the moved from the police department over to the sheriff's office, I believe it was partially his leadership that I don't know what he said, to his troops regarding the charging of that deputy for a shooting, but it's been significantly different, substantially different, and now officers turn their back on me when I walk up. So leadership matters, and whistleblower protection is only as good as the leadership makes it.
Thank you. I want to hit on something that Dr. Cleaver kind of spoke about a little bit earlier, which was bringing in police officers who kind of mirror the racial demographics of communities, bringing them into those communities. Does the panel think that is enough or good enough to try to help alleviate some of these issues we're having, or is it not doing enough? Is it too simplistic in the midst of all the other issues that we've talked about? I see, Dr. Like, you're shaking your head, and then I want to hear from Damon and Dr. Cleaver, if possible.
Yeah, there's just very little proof that. So, well, let me say it this way. I think that those changes, diversifying police departments so that they look more like the communities that they serve, is more of a symbolic rather than a substantive change, in that we certainly don't see any evidence that changes perceptions of police in those communities. concerns about aggressiveness and use of force from the police. I think it has a lot to do with the culture of policing as it currently is. And so even in some research that I was doing in St. Louis, I'm a St. Louis native, and to hear youth say that they're treated even more harsh by Black police officers than they are by white police officers, especially if it's a Black and white officer that they encounter, I think speaks volumes. And so research showing that the perception is and experience from people who are encountering the police that the race of the officer doesn't really matter in terms of how they're treated, wide scale. And so and I think you'll find similar literature research related to female officers, that some argue that female officers tend to be a little more aggressive in those encounters. And so I think that the goal then becomes to prove that you're blue, not female, not Black, but that you're blue. And so in doing so, they may adapt some of those problematic behaviors that are inherent to the culture as it currently is. And so I think that at best that those changes right now would be more symbolic than they could be substantive if we don't change the culture of policing.
Damon?
I really like what Dr. Light said, and it made me start to think about, this is a cultural reference, warning, cultural reference, but I remember a scene in Boys in the Hood where Ricky and Trey got pulled over, and it was a Black officer and a white officer, and it was the Black officer that really assaulted Trey. And when you have, and I think Dr. Like said it best, if you have individuals who have adopted the blue, that means that they've sort of forgotten where they've come from a bit, and they're not bringing their full self into that work, and they're not fully representing their community. However, I think that it's a step in the right direction when you focus on and have a aggressive hiring strategy to make sure that you have diversity within your department. I also think, though, that you have to take it a step further and look at how you are promoting individuals as well in those leadership positions, because that's when the culture will begin to shift. And we have to move beyond just talking about race. We're talking about gender. We're talking about language as well. I know the police department has, or they used to have, and I believe they still do, an immersion program where they make sure they have Spanish-speaking officers. That's something that needs to continue to happen, especially as we look at the demographics in our city and how they are constantly shifting as well. But I think that we also have to look at, people have their own definitions of community policing. Last year, I went on a research tour of Midwest cities that have significantly reduced violence, particularly homicides in their communities. And one example that still stands out to me is what Omaha has done. When I went in 2019, their 2018 homicide that they had for the year was 24 homicides for the year. Wow. And when I was there, I was like, man, we've had that in 1 month. But one of the things that I learned from the chief was that he did not want to overwhelm a community with police. What he wanted to do is, because he was seasoned and because he knew those neighborhoods, he knew what the real issues were. And so he assigned specific task force. So if there was, for example, if there was a string of robberies happening, then he had a robbery unit. But that robbery unit's goal was not necessarily, part of their goal was definitely finding out who's doing these strings of robberies and all of that. But it was more about how are we building relationships with neighbors and people in these communities who are being impacted by this. What is leading, because this is an opportunity crime. And so how can we reduce those opportunities? And so that's why that was his officer's assignment, was reducing those opportunity crimes. And so it was really smart policing that he was really initiating there. And so he made sure that he had the leadership that had that experience. Yes, they could, not necessarily, they didn't, but one quick thing that I'll say is that I think the population of African Americans there was about 12%, and their department was also at about 12% as well in terms of African Americans. So it reflected the community. Now they also, though, were able to build trust in that in the community because they could protect people when they came forward, so people felt safe. What I mean by that is they had a witness protection plan. Not only that, they had a reward fund, which we have a reward fund as well. There's $25,000. There's $25,000 as well, but they couple that with witness protection. So they did several different things in terms of that. They also employed community outreach workers, which are similar to what we have here in Kansas City, like Aim for Peace, except for those folks were employed by the police department, but they're housed at the YMCA. Half of their salaries paid by the police department and half of their salaries paid by the YMCA. But they're not officers, but they share information with those folks to say, hey, little Johnny is getting into trouble. We're watching him. Need you to go talk to him. Those guys go out and they talk to little Johnny. But when they talk to little Johnny, they talk about, hey, you need a job or something, man. Is this why you stealing? Is this why you're robbing people? Hey, we have a job. But that chief had already gone to different businesses and said, hey, I need your help with reducing crime. If I send a youth your way, will you give them an internship? Will you give them a job? And those are the kind of things that leadership did there to reduce the crime and violence and strengthen the relationship with the community. And so I think it just takes a strategic mindset. It takes tenacity. It takes understanding. It takes compassion. It takes a lot of building relationships with the community. And there is some policy oversight. There is trust and legitimacy within that police department. And they are constantly looking at training and evaluation and education as well. And so I think it takes a whole lot more than just hiring someone that looks like me to police this community. It takes a number of those things too.
God, I wish we had more time because there's so much in there that I want to talk to you about and ask about. But I only have time for one more question. And because I skipped Dr. Cleaver the last time around, I'm going to shoot this one to you. There's just such a large cry right now, obviously, for reforming the police or defunding, however you want to say it. But we know that in the past that hasn't worked because we're right back in this situation. What do you think, with the community push and the community involvement, what do you think is going to come out of this movement? And do you feel like this movement is different? And why do you feel like it's different?
Well, I'll begin by saying, yeah, I do think it is a little different, simply because it's not just African Americans out there demanding that. We're seeing Latinos and whites. So it does feel and look a lot different, at least from anything that I've seen in my lifetime. Are we going to get it? If we're talking about Kansas City, it's going to begin, if we're looking at reform within the police department, it's going to begin with local control. Until then, we won't have an independent review board. We won't have clear representation on the board of commissioners, police commissioners. I mean, what we need here is representation from each of the council districts on that commission. But it's going to begin with local control. I do believe it will happen. It may take a lot longer than what we're hoping. It's not going to be overnight, but I do think it's going to happen. I also want to say about the last question Damon stole, I was going to quote Ice Cube saying, white police showing out for the black police showing out for the white cop, but you beat me to it. Right. But yeah, I do think we will see some reform. I do believe it.
Thank you. And I think that now we're going to head over and start our Q&A with the audience.
Jasmine, thank you so much. First of all, thank you to those participants who have submitted questions. First of all, they're all fantastic questions. We could probably take another couple of hours knocking these out because these are all fantastic. I'm not going to say your last name. So this question is from Rosemary. Do you have an opinion on the increased presence of federal law enforcement officers in Kansas City? It's a subject of much debate and much controversy. I'll start with Jean and then I'll go to Dr. Cleaver and then Damon.
So first of all, I'm watching and talking to my partners in cities across America. One of my chairwoman roles is as the chairwoman of the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, which is a national organization of prosecutors of about the 40 biggest cities. So I have a good lifeline, to call these other prosecutors and kind of see what's happening. Portland is concerning. It's alarming. And I have not seen that effort here in Kansas City. If I did, I would be screaming about it. But I am, this is a panel about police, and I believe that my local police department is in the very best role to solve violent crime. I don't believe it is going to be effective to bring in agents, no matter how highly skilled they are in whatever areas of police work that they do. They don't know this community. They don't know the people. And they don't know anything about us. And if you're coming in for a short period of time, I do worry about the added concern that community members have brought to me. And it alarms me, as community members are alarmed about what their role is. I have spoken to the U.S. Attorney about my concerns and what I'm hearing from community. And he has promised me that they are here to serve as support to the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. So if there can be a homicide solved with their help, if they can provide some kind of additional work with phones or, DNA, ballistics, I'll take that because I'd love to see more homicides solved. But I just believe my local police departments are better able at doing that.
Understood. Dr. Cleaver and then Damon.
Yeah, I think if you're talking about a lack of trust between the community and law enforcement, that is even greater when we're talking about the federal government, federal agents. What I've heard a lot are about arrests, but arrests aren't necessarily convictions. And when you're talking about just arresting people, then you're talking about minorities facing the brunt of that. And I've heard a little talk about harassment, but you're also seeing people just display a lack of trust. I think it's always bad to bring in a group to disrupt things, and then that group just leaves. Because those of us who live in this community are left to deal with the aftermath. So, like Jean, I just believe the local law enforcement is the route instead of bringing in federal agents. I do believe it is a political move, no question about it.
Damon, you were close with the PD. What are your thoughts on the federal show of force?
I like Jean said, I think if they are focusing on leveraging the kind of resources, like looking at DNA, ballistics, and things like that, then I think it's welcome. But I've said this in a couple of different spaces, and I'll tell you a quick story behind excuse me, what I'm about to say. But I think in general, we've seen this kind of move before when you talk about addressing violent crime and government really getting involved. We've seen it in the 80s and 90s with the tough on drugs and all of that. And so I believe that we're going to see an increase in incarceration, but we will not see a decrease in violent crime. And earlier this week, I met with the special agent in charge at the FBI to sort of urge them to come forward and share what their role is within Operation Legend. and to encourage the U.S. Attorney and the ATF and the DEA to do the same. And so I am hoping, I got word today that they are working on it. And so I'm hoping that sometime next week that they will come forward as a collective and share with the community what their specific roles are. When I asked the FBI, one, how many agents are here? They gave me approximately 50. When I asked them, what are those 50 agents doing? Are they talking to residents in terms of witnesses and things of that nature? Are they working autonomously? I was told that they're not working autonomously. I was told that they are being plugged into existing task force that currently exist as well. But also raised the fact that people are in fear that this could turn out to be another Portland type of situation. That is a legitimate fear. I did ask the question, what happens after the end of the 60 days? Is there a plan to continue this? Because if they do see a sharp decline, that's really because they've had pressure and made more arrests. But that doesn't mean that there's going to be a decline in homicides. So we'll still see this uptick in homicides just because we're getting more arrests. So what's the plan then? And they really don't have an answer for that. And so I think we have to have a watchful eye. We have to be critical of the information that we're being fed. We need to understand, like they just said that there was 50 arrests made. Were those arrests that were already going to happen, that KCPD were going to do? There are already active warrants out there and they just need the extra manpower. I think as citizens, we deserve to know, we deserve to have some distinction around some of that because what we're going to end up hearing is that we'll see the president on the news saying, hey, it was successful, Operation Legend is successful, we're going to do it in several other cities, when in fact, these arrests would have happened regardless. Would they have happened in a longer time frame? Perhaps. But that's something, if that's the case, that's something we need to look at as well. And that could give credence to the reason why, the city's budget is increasing every year because, hey, if we have more police, they can make more arrests and they can do these things because they don't have the capacity now. But those are all things we have to consider. But I think we have to closely examine and be very critical of this process and what's being presented to us with Operation Legend as well. Because I think it's going to be some critical learnings for all of us surrounding this. We just need to make sure, though, that we're vocal that, hey, that we're not doing this whole Portland thing. It's not happening here. And so, yeah.
Thank you. Our next audience questions comes from Stephanie, and her question is, are there successful examples from other cities of the reallocation of funding to, for instance, social services or mental health services instead of pumping it all into the police department? And I'll ask Jean first, and then if anyone else knows anything about this, please feel free to hop in.
The best example of this is showing the Camden Police Department and how they literally defunded their police department, but they rebuilt it through, I believe, their sheriff's office. And so they had a structure, ready to go. And it's been really remarkably successful. I think Camden is just a great example for us to look to when we're all very skittish about the word defund. But looking at Camden, New Jersey showed when they did eliminate their police department and then fold it, I think, through their sheriff's department, they reduced violent crime. Camden used to be a very dangerous place, and it is they've turned around violent crime in their city since this effort, since the defunding of the police and moving them over to the sheriff's department.
Damon, your mic is on. Did you have something for that too?
Oh, I know Microsoft.
Okay.
No, I was going to say that Camden, New Jersey. I'm actually just posting a link in the chat. Perhaps you guys can share it. This
You've just muted yourself.
technology. I've just posted a link in the chat that can hopefully be shared. But I think Camden is a great example, and I don't want to repeat what Jean said. So she stole my thunder. So that's it.
Another question that I just saw from Melissa, kind of in the idea of reallocating funds, is there training that's necessary in terms of when to call the police and when not? Or another question that someone else posed is, who else do we call if there is an issue, with your neighbor or with the spouse?
People can always call the non-emergency number for the police department, 234-5000, and kind of get guidance from there. If it's a sort of a housing issue, sometimes you can just call 311 and get directed to some other social service agencies as well. We get a lot of calls at ad hoc. Most of the time when people call us is because the police didn't feel like the police got them the results that they wanted, and so they've called us. So people can always call us too, but I think using 311 is a great resource, and if people are unsure if it's police related or not, they can always call the non-emergency number.
All right, here's a question that I may mispronounce the name. Rhiannon. She has been impressed by the work of local Black organizers such as One Struggle KC and Black Rainbow around police reform, in particular with KCPD. What are your thoughts on the role of Black activists and organizers in meaningful police reform? Very, very good question. Let's go with Damon and then Dr. Cleaver.
I'm glad to see it. I did community organizing for many years, and I'm always glad to see people taking action as well. But my hopes is that these actions continue to the polls. So next week, August 4th, we need people to go and vote. In November, we need people to go and vote. So I really would like to see folks mobilize around voting so that we can really see some of the changes that we so desperately need in this city. But I'm really proud to see a lot of the younger folks being more active, and the crowds are more diverse than when I was organizing as well. So really glad to see it.
Dr. Cleaver?
Yeah, I'd agree with Damon. I mean, I think it's great to see all these activists, which is nothing new. If you look back during the height of the civil rights movement, you had a lot of young activists. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is one example. So I think it's great. I think when you have different organizations all pushing for the same thing, I think that's what creates momentum to bring about change. So I'm all in favor of it.
Here's one from Brad. New York City spends 6% of their total budget on policing. Kansas City spends 38% of our budget. Are we getting our money's worth? What if some of the money was diverted to social services, job training, job creation, education? And I'll tag on to that. Is it the responsibility of the local government maybe to also consider shifting some of their funding into some of these programs and not just have it all fall on the police budget necessarily? Anybody who wants that one?
So again, I think this goes back to what we've always recognized is that crime is a social ill that follows many of the same patterns and trends as other social ills in our society: unemployment, underemployment, poverty, and housing crises. So crime tends to increase during those time periods, and so reallocating funding to those entities is going to have, I think, sustainable and long-term impact on our crime rates. And certainly when you think about diverting some of, so taking some of those tasks from the police. So in the grand scheme of things, then it more centralizes the work that they do and situates it within what's in their purview and their capabilities to do and to do effectively. And so, again, using mental health professionals to deal with mental health issues is going to be important. That law enforcement aren't trained typically to or have the skill set that a mental health professional would to deal with with those issues. No different than homelessness, right? If we spent more funding on dealing with the situation of homelessness, then the criminal justice system does not have to take on that issue as wholeheartedly. So I think that can have a huge impact on crime rates overall, but even in terms of de-escalating by avoiding, unnecessary or conflicts between the community and the police. I think it can have some huge impacts across the board.
Dr. Cleaver?
Yeah, I would say having more police with more weapons doesn't stop crime. I mean, that's really not the role of the police department to stop crime. So yes, I think investing money in programs, job training, education, all of those things would play a great role in reducing the crime. I think, as I said, the police, their job is to go out and arrest. They serve and protect. And sometimes we have to look at ourselves because we ask the police to do more than what they are actually trained and paid to do. And so I think reallocating money for specific programs, we can prevent more. I always say the job of people who work in the community, our job is actually to put the police out of business. Because we want to reduce crime to a minimum or to nothing at all. And so that doesn't happen with the police department.
I'm sorry that I lost the name of the person who asked this next question, but it's for anyone that can answer it. What does it really mean that the Board of Police Commissioners has 6 lobbyists? What are those lobbyists lobbying for?
Budget. I would guess budget. And it's probably, it's a pretty substantial portion of the city's budget goes to police and fire. So I don't know that there's much left when it comes to, other city obligations and duties, to shift funding around there. I just don't think there's a whole lot left because the lion's share of that budget goes to both police and to fire already.
Mm-hmm. And I hate to use the T word, but do you foresee that maybe there might be some tax that might be levied in order to support these kind of programs? Jean?
I think that Kansas City is pretty heavily leveraged right now with taxes. I don't know that we can ask our citizenry to give more when, perhaps there is another answer. So I worry about the burden that we shift on citizens. And I get more and more concerned about, these sales taxes, which I was raised to believe was a regressive tax, and you should be careful about, saddling people with a regressive tax. So that seems to be the lever that we pull most often. And that single mom who's trying to buy a loaf of bread and a gallon of milk, the hit on her is much harder, than people like me. So I think, I don't know that that's the right answer. I think maybe reallocating or looking at city's budget to see, are there other priorities that we want to put a focus on?
You agree, Dr. Cleaver?
I'm sorry, I was so involved with answering the questions in the chat. Responding to some of those questions.
Okay, that's fine. And here's one from John. I believe it needs to be recognized that policing cannot no longer be viewed as a, quote, blue collar type of occupation that anybody can do. The variety of duties that police officers perform call for a new approach to recruitment and training that involves more work in the development of interpersonal skills. It is no longer about brawn, but it is instead more about brains and adaptive thinking.
Well, I do think that we do have to broaden the training that happens with police officers. It has to be more than just about tactics. I mean, police have to be trained in de-escalation. They have to be trained in cultural awareness. So I would agree that we do have to broaden what officers are taught. And you know, I'm a part of the Post Commission, which is Peace Officer Standard Training Commission, which licenses police departments and peace officers. And one of the things that is going to happen as a result of George Floyd and some of the other killings are listening sessions around the state of Missouri, where the Post Commission, that again license officers and departments, listening to the community to get feedback on what needs to happen when it comes to training, and not just going through the academy, but also looking at continuing education. And so I would urge, those things should be coming up soon, but I would urge us to take note of that, because again, this is the body that actually gives a license and trains officers. But I'm in complete agreement with what the last person said.
Mm-hmm. Damon, any thoughts?
No, I think Pastor Cleaver hit the nail on the head, and I think the statement / question that the person has made, I think, is a relevant point. But I wish we had more law enforcement officials on the panel who could really speak to it from their perspective as well. So I can't really speak to it because I'm not a police officer.
Yeah, next month, right?
Our next question, it says, what is being done to prevent class and race discrimination in jails and prisons? For example, class and race are significantly linked to whether or not you're able to post bail, and that is unjust. Folks are being incarcerated before they've even been determined guilty.
Might be able to take a stab at that question. You know, our local jail in Jackson County has been the subject of a lot of bad news, and I will say it is being professionally run, and I'm really impressed with the change in leadership at the jail. It is a much safer place than it was 2 and 3 years ago, when all the news about that jail was constantly spilling out. That being said, however, you know, you have to have an adequate building to be able to provide adequate service to folks who are incarcerated and those pending trial. So I think a new jail is on the horizon. Someday in Jackson County, I think in the near horizon. And the other thing that I would say about those who cannot afford to post bail is that, you know, I am working with our criminal justice partners in taking a look at what we did in response to COVID and how can we do this post-COVID. Because I would have told you before COVID happened that I thought we were pretty at our margins on who we could let out of jail safely and not risk public safety. But I think I no longer see it that way. I do think that we've kind of put problems off for another day as long as COVID still exists. However, I think we can look at a group of folks that have a hard time coming to court on time, which often lands them back in jail for a period of time. Those of us who are in the criminal justice system are taking a hard look at those cases to see how else can we do it. And when we get past COVID, Can we do this smarter and not relying so often on incarceration as the way to correct a problem? That there's got to be some other ways that we do that. So I'm very hopeful about where we're going in the future about reducing our population even further without harming public safety.
Here's one from Alice. Why do our police officers carry such high-powered guns? They are assault weapons and more lethal than is appropriate. I'm not sure that any of
I would
us
just say,
agree
in
with
all fairness, to police, I simply believe because it's many people on the street have high-powered weapons, and in order to really defend, you really do have to have some sort of firepower. So I want to offer that out on behalf of police officers. There are all sorts of guns on the street, which leads to the other question: gun reform laws, because it is so easy for anyone to get a gun. Missouri, it is extremely easy to get a gun and carry guns. But I would also argue that some of the guns that we're seeing on the street aren't coming from Walmart or stores. They're being sold right there on the street because those guns are extremely expensive. So somehow they're getting into the community where people are able to purchase them. But also simply, we do need reform when it comes to gun laws.
Damon, do you have any thoughts?
I'll just say this. These guns are a lot more accessible than people realize, and I know that personally because I'm a gun owner, and I've purchased guns online, and it scared me the last time I did it because of how easy it was. Where the gun was delivered to, where I got it from, it was kind of sketchy. So the availability of being able to purchase guns online is they're not, you don't have to find somebody on the street anymore. You can find what you're looking for online. So that's another big issue. But I was just looking at a report that someone was arrested and charged under Operation Legend. And the person had, so it was a female who had a AK style 9mm, which they refer to as a Century Arms Draco. And if you ever seen a picture of what that looks like, it looks like a mini AK handgun, and shoots off 30 rounds. And so I think that the police department does need to be equipped to defend themselves with the availability of those types of guns that are on the streets and that you can buy really at low prices as well. That particular gun there can be purchased for $300 online. I mean, so it's and it's out there. So they do need to be able to protect themselves.
Dr. Like, there's a question for you from Jason. Is there evidence that local control is more or less effective in terms of solving / reducing crimes, violent or otherwise? What does the research say, if anything, at this point?
That I'm not certain that the research is emphatic one way or the other in terms of that. I think it goes back to the points that were made earlier in terms of local control, sort of the pros and cons against it. And then how that affects how the police are mobilized and what they do. At the end of the day, I think that's what's going to be really effective in terms of reducing crime and violent crime in particular is going to be addressing some of these issues we talked about before on a macro level, really looking at addressing issues of poverty, unemployment, housing. All of those things are going to have some long-term impacts on crime rates. But then in terms of police community relations and what that can, understand that they have a common goal, and that is to reduce crime, and how you can link them together to work effectively toward combating crime is going to have an impact on crime rates locally and beyond.
And this next one is for anyone who can answer it. Reverend Chauncey Black asks, if the past governor took or usurped control of the Kansas City Police Department, what mechanism was employed to do so, and how can that mechanism be reversed, as no voting was required to do so. Do we know at all how we would keep local control if we gained it in the next election?
Well,
I imagine if we, go ahead.
now I was just going to say, if we had local control, then I don't see how we would lose it unless we gave it up. Once that power or authority is given to Kansas City, I can't speak to anything other than that. Once we have it, just like we can't take it back from Jefferson City, I don't see how Jefferson City would be able to take it away from Kansas City unless we have something similar to what happened in the Pendergast area.
Jean?
I was just going to say, I think the way we gain local control is pretty complicated. It has to start in the Missouri legislature. A bill has to be passed within the, through both chambers and signed by the governor. And then I think it has to go to a statewide vote in order to get local control back. So it's, I know it's on the, well, I think it's on the ballot this November about whether or not the citizens think about local control, but that's really symbolic. It's not, it has no legal import, I believe. But it would be symbolic, I think, to legislators. If you're a legislator, from St. Louis or from Boone County or Greene County, and a vote was taken in Kansas City, and it appears Kansas Cityans want local control, then I don't imagine that they would stand in the way of legislation.
And then I think our final question comes from Dee. How can we educate the community on the difference in local control and state control? I don't think that the average KC citizen understands the difference.
Damon, how about you on that one?
I was going to let Dr. Light take that.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Go ahead, Professor.
Well, I was hoping that some of our colleagues who spoke on this earlier in the panel could give us some resources, myself included, for this. And I think it is going to take doing a history lesson on local and state control, what that means for Kansas City, and the history of it here. But I would lean toward those who have been able to speak more in detail to that and the history of that for Kansas City. I would trust their expertise better than mine.
I thought I saw Jean leaning forward. Am I mistaken?
But I did want to take it from Reverend Cleaver.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Doctor.
Well, I guess the question is, how do we educate? And if that's, I think in forums like this, we educate the different. I mean, it really boils down to the governor appointing commissioners as opposed to the mayor and the city council appointing commissioners. But also with local control, there is more room for us to restructure even how the Board of Commissioners looks. So state control, the governor appoints; local control, the city and or city council.
And I think what's important about that is, the governor has not lived in Kansas City. He's not spent time in Kansas City. He does not know us. And that's it's a very political appointment process to serve in that way. Now, it doesn't mean that politics are extracted from any other system, but it does mean those who were locally elected by individuals that are served by the police department would have a role in determining, a greater role in determining, the course of that department. So there can be a lot of different ways local control is set up. So that still remains to be determined how it would be structured and set up. But if we trust those individuals that we just elected to the mayor's role and to the city council role, then we should trust them, to have a say in their department because they're speaking through their citizenry.
Well said. Police, we will all acknowledge have an extremely complex job, and we should make clear that our discussion is in no way an indictment on those officers who come to work, respond to our calls for assistance, and keep us safe. However, we're all subject to criticism in the jobs that we perform and calls for our systems to do better. And we believe this is why it's important to have critical conversations such as this. However, we do want to express our thanks to the officers for the job that you do. We're going to have to leave it there for today. Many thanks to dole out. First, let me thank the panel, Dr. Emmanuel Cleaver III, pastor of St. James United Methodist Church, Jean Peters Baker, Jackson County's elected prosecutor, Damon Daniel, president of the Ad Hoc Group Against Crime, Dr. Toya Like, associate professor of criminal justice and criminology here at UMKC. Thank you to my co-moderator, Jasmine Ward. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to moderating part 2 of this critical discussion with you next month. And thank you to our UMKC Chancellor, to his Chief of Staff, Kimiko Gilmore, to Dr. Kimberly Johnson, Bridget Cohn, Yvonne Hood, Veronica Jackson, and to all the host of others making these events possible. And to you, the viewers, we ask you to join us again for future critical discussions. Until next time, please stay well and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Thank you, panel. We will be in touch with you. Thank you. Thanks, Jasmine.
Okay, I didn't know if I could. Bye, thank you.
Well, we still have 59 people, but it's dropping quickly. So I think they're
Okay.
But anyway, thank you so much. Excellent
Thank you.
job. Appreciate
It
you.
was fun.
And
I'll
I'm
talk
sure-
to you. Sorry.
ahead.
I was
No,
gonna
I was
talk
gonna
to you guys soon.
Well, I'm sure we'll have some sort of a debrief, at some
Okay.
point as well. But it went well. Thank you so much. Appreciate you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.